8 royal families control most of Europe. 3 banking dynasties control most of the world's wealth. And if you trace their family trees back through medieval records, through Rome, through claimed Trojan ancestors, they all converge on the same place, ancient Mesopotamia. 12 dynasties, 1 clay prism, and a claim so extraordinary that modern scholars dismiss it as mythology. Kingship descended from heaven. But what if they weren't speaking metaphorically? What if the bloodlines they documented obsessively, mathematically across 1,000 years are the same bloodlines sitting in Davos right now? There's a clay prism sitting in a glass case at the Ishmaelian Museum in Oxford, England. Catalogue number AN 1923 444. Most scholars call it the Weld Blundell prism. It's roughly 8 inches tall, 4-sided. Made of baked clay, the color of dried blood. Herbert Weld Blundell excavated it in 1922 near the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq. It's been sitting behind glass for a century, while maybe a few hundred people per year actually stopped to read what it says. If you stood in front of it today, you'd see 400 lines of cuneiform script, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay before it was baked hard. 4 sides, dense columns of text, every character still sharp after 4,000 years. The clay was soft once. Someone's hands shaped it. Someone's reed stylus pressed these marks. Someone who lived closer in time to us than to the events they were documenting decided this information was important enough to preserve in the most permanent medium they had. This isn't mythology. This isn't poetry. This isn't a religious hymn. It's a list. A list of kings, a list of cities, a list of how long each king ruled, a list of dynasties, who came from where, who succeeded whom, which families held power, and for how long. The Sumerians were accountants. They invented writing specifically to keep track of things. Barley rations, sheep herds, labor obligations, land ownership. They were obsessive about documentation, and they applied that same obsessive precision to documenting their rulers. The prism opens with a single line in Sumerian Namligalanta. Kingship descended from heaven. Not kingship was blessed by heaven. Not kingship was approved by heaven. Not the king was chosen by the gods. Kingship, the institution, the authority, the right to rule, descended, came down, moved from point A in the sky to point B on earth. The verb is the same one used in warehouse receipts. Barley descended from the storehouse to the workers. Physical movement, material transfer. And then the list begins. When kingship descended from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu. 8 kings ruled before a catastrophic flood. After the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven. Again. That word again matters. We'll come back to it. And 12 major royal dynasties emerged. 12 families who claimed they didn't just rule because they were strong or smart or popular. They ruled because they carried something in their blood. Something that came from the beings who brought kingship down from heaven in the first place. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Those 12 dynasties didn't disappear into history. They documented their genealogies with the same precision they use for everything else. Temple archives full of family records, marriage contracts, succession documents. And when subsequent empires conquered Mesopotamia, the Hittites, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, they didn't erase those bloodlines. They married into them. They adopted the genealogical claims. They transported the legitimacy framework westward. Medieval European nobility traced their ancestry back to Troy. Troy was a Hittite vassal state. The Hittites documented marriage alliances with Mesopotamian royal families. We have the tablets. We look at them. Roman, patrician families claimed Trojan descent. Germanic nobility claimed Roman descent. Every major European royal house today traces back through these claimed connections to the ancient Near East. And here's the part that should make you pause. Modern genetic studies support ancient admixture from the Near East into European elite populations during the Bronze Age. The genealogical claims that scholars dismissed as medieval fabrications turn out to have genetic evidence supporting them. So, we're going to do something historians usually avoid. We're going to take these ancient records seriously, not as mythology, not as propaganda, but as what they claim to be genealogical documentation. We're going to trace the 12 bloodlines forward through every conquest, every migration, every name change, all the way to the families holding power today. Before we start that journey, comment below. Which modern family's ancestry are you most curious about? The British royals, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers? Because by the end of this investigation, also write where you are listening from. We're connecting all of them back to specific dynasties on this clay prism. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is following documented genealogies and asking what they mean. The tablets exist. The family records exist. The genetic evidence exists. The concentration of power in specific families exists. What we're investigating is whether these things are connected, and if so, how and why. Let's start with what the clay prism actually documents. Let's start before the flood, before the waters rose. The Blundell prism lists 8 kings who ruled before the catastrophe. Not vague antiquity-specific kings, specific cities, specific reign lengths. And this is where modern scholars stop taking it seriously, because the numbers are impossible. Alulum ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Ulalga ruled for 36,000 years. And Imeluana ruled Battabira for 43,200 years. And Imingulana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzid, yes, the same figure who appears in later myths as Inanna's shepherd Luva ruled for 36,000 years. And Sapatsadana ruled Larak for 28,800 years. And Imenjarana ruled Sipur for 21,000 years. And Ubertutu ruled Shurapak for 18,600 years. Add them up. 241,200 years of documented kingship before the flood. Mainstream scholarship's response. Obviously mythological inflation. Ancient peoples exaggerated the antiquity of their origins to establish legitimacy. The numbers are symbolic, not historical. Don't take them literally. But here's the problem with that dismissal. The Sumerians were not prone to symbolic exaggeration when it came to numbers. We have thousands of their administrative tablets. They calculated compound interest. They tracked astronomical cycles with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. The Plumpton 322 tablet sitting in Columbia University's collection demonstrates they understood Pythagorean triples 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. These were people who took mathematics seriously. The same scribal schools that produced accurate astronomical tables and architectural calculations also produced a king list. Why would they suddenly abandon precision for the most important document they created the record of? Legitimate authority. And the numbers aren't random. They're multiples of 3,600. The Sumerian Sar, a key unit in their sexagesimal counting system. Alulum 28,800. And Ulalgar 36,000, that's 8 Sar, 10 Sar. Imeluana, 43,200, that's 12 Sar. The reign lengths are mathematically structured. Multiple independent copies of the king list preserve the same numbers. The Blundell prism, tablet WB62, also at the Ishmaelian fragments from Nippur and the University of Pennsylvania Museum fragments in the British Museum. Across different cities, different time periods, different scribal traditions, the same kings, the same sequence, the same impossible numbers. That's not how mythology evolves. Myths change with each telling. These numbers were standardized, fixed, preserved with the precision of legal documents. So, we're left with the question. What were they documenting? 3 possibilities. And we're going to keep all 3 open as we proceed. Possibility 1: these are symbolic numbers encoding something other than literal years. Perhaps generations. Perhaps dynasties, perhaps cycles of some kind. The specific encoding is lost to us, but the underlying structure is real genealogical information, compressed into numerical form. Possibility 2: these numbers reflect a different way of counting time, or represent the reigns of institutions rather than individuals. Alulum might be a title held by successive rulers, with 28,800 years representing the total duration of that office across multiple holders. Possibility 3: the numbers are accurate, and our understanding of human history before 3000 BC is fundamentally incomplete. For now, we don't need to resolve which interpretation is correct. What matters is what happens next. Then, the flood swept over. 1 line, 5 words in English, 3 in Sumerian. Uber, the flood came. And this is where the king list transforms from impossible curiosity to something that demands attention. Because the flood isn't just mythology, it's geology. Archaeologists excavating Sumerian cities in the 1920s and 30s Shurapak Kish found something they didn't expect: distinct flood layers. Sterile silt deposits 8 to 11 feet thick, sitting between occupation layers. Below the silt, pottery and tools from one cultural period. Above it, pottery and tools from a later period. The silt itself contained no artifacts, no remains, just river sediment that had settled out as standing water. Leonard Woolley, excavating the Royal Cemetery of Ur 1929, initially thought he'd reached virgin soil beneath the city. Then he kept digging and found another occupation layer beneath the flood deposit. His workmen locals from the area told him immediately that is the flood of Noah. Carbon dating places these flood deposits around 2900 BC. Not a global deluge. There's no geological evidence for that, but a catastrophic regional flood in southern Mesopotamia that would have appeared world-ending to anyone living there. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, fed by snowmelt from the Zagros and Taurus mountains, occasionally produce devastating floods. Even today, 4,000 years ago, with more primitive flood control infrastructure, a major flooding event could have buried the entire alluvial plain underwater for weeks or months. Multiple Mesopotamian texts describe the same event. The Eridu Genesis preserved on tablet CPS 2673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Describes the gods deciding to destroy humanity through flood, with the god Enki. Warnings I Sudra to build a boat. The Atrahasis epic preserved on multiple tablets in the British Museum describes the same event with additional detail. The noise of humanity disturbing the gods, the decision to eliminate the problem. One family's survival. And then in the king list, after the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. 3 things to notice. First again, kingship descended from heaven a second time. The same process that established the antediluvian kings is repeated after the catastrophe. Whatever brought kingship the first time brings it a second time. Second, the location changes. Before the flood, kingship was in Eridu, the southernmost major city. After the flood, it's in Kish, further north, as if the center of civilization shifted with the survivors. Third, the reign links change. Post-flood kings still have impossibly long reigns by modern standards. The first king of Kish ruled 1,200 years according to the list, but the numbers are dropping 1,200 years instead of 28,800. Then 900 years, then 600, progressively approaching human parameters over the following dynasties. If these were pure inventions, why show decline? Why not maintain the impressive ancient numbers to make later kings seem equally legitimate? The pattern of decreasing reign lengths suggests the list is documenting something real, a transition from one kind of ruler to another, or one way of counting to another, or one reality to another. And here's what matters for our investigation. The post-flood dynasties claim genealogical connection to what came before. They don't say the old world ended and we started fresh. They say kingship descended from heaven again, implying connection to the previous descent. They claim that certain families survived the catastrophe, that those families carried forward the bloodlines established before the flood, that the divinehuman mixing that created the antediluvian kings didn't end. It continued through selected survivors. Sudra, the Sumerian Noah, doesn't just survive the flood in the Eridu Genesis. He receives immortality and divine status afterward. He becomes something between human and God, and he becomes, in the mythology, the ancestor of subsequent humanity. This pattern catastrophe, selective survival, elevated status for survivors, genealogical claims connecting post-catastrophe rulers to pre-catastrophe. Divinity is the foundation of everything that follows. Because now we get to the 12 major dynasties that emerged after the flood, each claiming this special ancestry, each maintaining it obsessively through 1,000 years of documented history. Before we enumerate them, understand what we're looking at. These aren't all the cities or all the rulers mentioned in Mesopotamian records. These are 12 specific dynasties that the king list and related texts emphasize. 12 families who claimed the strongest connection to the original divine bloodlines. 12 houses whose genealogical records were preserved with particular care. 12 lineages that subsequent conquerors felt compelled to connect themselves to even if they had to fabricate the connection. The number 12 itself appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian religious and political structure. 12 major gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. 12 months in the Mesopotamian calendar. 12 divisions of the zodiac first documented in Mesopotamian astronomy. Whether the 12 dynasties were chosen to match this cosmological structure or whether the cosmological structure reflects the political reality, we can't know. But the pattern is there. So let's name them. Let's identify the 12 bloodlines that this investigation will trace forward through time to the boardrooms and palaces of today. From 8 kings to 12 dynasties after the flood. Kingship doesn't follow one continuous line anymore. It branches. Multiple cities claim legitimate authority simultaneously, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes acknowledging each other's status. The Sumerian king list documents this by saying kingship was taken to different cities, Kish, then Uruk, then back to Kish, in a complex pattern of succession that historians still debate. But within that complexity, 12 dynasties stand out. 12 families. His claims to divine ancestry were documented most thoroughly, whose succession was most carefully recorded. His legitimacy was most widely acknowledged even by their rivals. Let me be clear about what we're doing here. We're identifying these 12 based on multiple criteria: prominence in the king list itself, supporting documentation in other texts, archaeological confirmation of their power, the extent of preserved genealogical records, and their importance to subsequent dynasties who claimed connection to them. This isn't arbitrary. These are the dynasties that mattered to the ancient Mesopotamians themselves. The ones they kept coming back to, the ones they treated as the foundation of legitimate authority. Dynasty number 1, the first dynasty of Kish. After the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Kish is the first post-flood capital. 23 kings documented in the king list. The dynasty begins with Jushur, about whom we know almost nothing except that he ruled 1,200 years according to the list. Then comes Kalasinabal, Nanjashlishma, in Terahana, Abum, Puanim, Calibum, and a succession of names that are difficult to reconstruct because the tablets are damaged. But then we get to Etana. Etana, who ascended to heaven, is the most famous king of the first Kish dynasty. He appears not just in the king list, but in separate Sumerian and Akkadian myths. The myth says he was unable to have children. The royal bloodline was threatened with extinction. He prays to the sun god Shamash, who directs him to rescue an eagle trapped in a pit. The eagle, grateful, carries Etana up to heaven to obtain the plant of birth that will allow his wife to conceive. Read. That is mythology if you want. But notice what it's actually about: the obsessive concern with continuing the bloodline. Etana doesn't go to heaven for wisdom or power, wealth. He goes to ensure he has an heir. The maintenance of the royal bloodline is so important that it justifies a journey to the divine realm. It succeeds. His son Bala is born and becomes king after him. The bloodline continues. The first dynasty of Kish was excavated by Stephen Langdon and others in the 1920s and 30s. They found massive mud brick architecture, royal tombs, evidence of centralized power. This wasn't mythology. These were real rulers controlling real territory. The dynasty's total documented reign in the king list 24,510 years across 23 kings. The numbers are still inflated, but dropping. The first king's 1,200 years has become more typical reign lengths of 400 years, then 300, then eventually approaching realistic numbers. And every subsequent dynasty that claims legitimacy looks back to Kish. Even when kingship is taken to Uruk, the Uruk kings acknowledge Kish as the source of post-flood authority. Dynasty number 2, the first dynasty of Uruk. Uruk is the city of Gilgamesh. In the king list, the first dynasty of Uruk includes 12 kings, beginning with Meskiak-Kashur, who entered the sea and ascended the mountain. His son is Enmerkar, the legendary founder of Uruk, who built its walls. Then comes Lugalbanta, the shepherd who became king. And then Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the most famous works of ancient literature. But before it was literature, Gilgamesh was a historical king. The king list places him firmly in the sequence: son of Lugalbanta, ruler of Uruk, reigning 126 years. What matters for our investigation is Gilgamesh's genealogy, because the epic preserves it explicitly. His father is Lugalbanta, a human king, though the myths say Lugalbanta was semi-divine himself. His mother is the goddess Ninsun. Not a priestess representing the goddess, not a woman blessed by the goddess herself. The epic states it clearly. 2/3 of him is God. On 1/3 of him is human. Think about that fraction. 2/3 divine, on 1/3 human. That only makes sense if divinity is something that can be measured, quantified, inherited. It's genetic language. If Gilgamesh's mother is fully divine and his father is half divine, as the myth suggests about Lugalbanta, then Gilgamesh is 3/4 divine, which rounds to 2/3 in Sumerian mathematical approximation. This isn't symbolic. This is a bloodline claim. Gilgamesh rules Uruk because of what he inherited from his parents. The Epic of Gilgamesh is ultimately about mortality. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, watches his friend Enkidu die and becomes obsessed with escaping death himself. He journeys to find Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood survivor. The Sumerian Sutra, who has been granted immortality. Gilgamesh wants to know how to achieve the same thing. Why? Because he's 2/3 divine, but on 1/3 human. And that on 1/3 is killing him. He's watching his divine nature war with his human mortality. Utnapishtim tells him, you can't. Immortality was granted to me as a unique exception after the flood. The old world is gone. You're part of the new world, and in the new world, even the children of gods die. The epic is a lament for the loss of the antediluvian world. A recognition that something changed. The bloodlines continue, but they're diluted. The impossible longevity of the pre-flood kings is fading. Archaeological excavations at Uruk confirm massive early dynastic occupation. The city walls attributed to Gilgamesh. In myth exist perimeter walls enclosing over 2,000 acres, among the largest ancient city walls ever constructed. And Gilgamesh's bloodline continues. His son, Anungal, succeeds him, then his grandson. The first dynasty of Uruk maintains power for generations before kingship is taken to Ur. Dynasty number 3, the first dynasty of Ur. In southern Mesopotamia, it becomes the third major power center. The king list documents 4 kings of the first dynasty, beginning with Mesanapata around 2600 BC. And here's where archaeological confirmation becomes overwhelming. In the 1920s, Leonard Woolley excavated the royal cemetery's 16 royal tombs from the first dynasty period. The wealth was staggering. Gold helmets, lapis lazuli, jewelry, musical instruments. And the tombs included human sacrifices. Dozens of attendants buried alive with their rulers, apparently walking into the tomb willingly and drinking poison to accompany their king or queen into death. Why would dozens of people willingly die for their ruler? The standard explanation is religious devotion or cultural obligation or coercion. But consider another possibility. If you genuinely believed your ruler was semi-divine, carried the blood of the gods, and was going to continue existing in an afterlife where divine blood mattered, then accompanying them might seem like the rational choice. Your status in the next world depends on maintaining your association with the bloodline. Tomb PG 779, the tomb of Queen Puabi, contained her body adorned with an elaborate headdress of gold and lapis, surrounded by 74 attendants. The skeleton of Puabi herself was examined by physical anthropologists. Nothing unusual was found. She was human, by all measurable standards. But if the bloodline theory is true, we wouldn't necessarily expect physical differences visible in skeletal remains. We'd expect genetic differences, which we can't test because DNA preservation from 4,600-year-old remains in Mesopotamian soil conditions is essentially zero. What we can observe is the treatment. Rulers of the first dynasty of Ur were treated as fundamentally different from common people. The quantity of resources devoted to their burials, the human sacrifice, the preservation of their genealogies and the king lists. All of this speaks to a society that believed bloodline mattered at a metaphysical level. Dynasty number 4, the dynasty of Awan. Awan is more mysterious. It's listed in the king list as a rival power. 3 kings documented, controlling territory in Elam, eastern Mesopotamia, in what's now Iran. The dynasty competed with Kish for supremacy, and apparently won for a time before kingship returned west. We haven't definitively located Awan archaeologically. The name appears in later Elamite texts, but the city itself remains unexcavated or unidentified. What matters is that even this rival Eastern dynasty is included in the king list. Even foreign conquerors, if they held power over Mesopotamian territory, felt compelled to claim connection to the original bloodlines, or were retroactively incorporated into the genealogical sequence by later scribes. The pattern legitimate authority requires genealogical legitimacy. Conquest alone isn't enough. You must connect yourself to the families who carried the original divine mandate. Dynasty number 5, the dynasty of Lagash. Lagash wasn't a capital in the king list's main sequence, but it's one of the most extensively documented dynasties we have. Why? Because Lagash's rulers left more inscriptions than almost anyone else in Mesopotamian history. The dynasty begins with Urnensh around 2500 BC. We have his foundation plaques, his building inscriptions, his victory monuments. His successors Enidum, Inanidum, and Intemino all left detailed records of their reigns. Enidum's Stele of the Vultures, now in the Louvre, commemorates his victory over the rival city of Umma. The inscription describes him as the seed implanted by Ninjursu, Ninjursu being the city's patron deity, not blessed by Ninjursu, not chosen by Ninjursu. The seed implanted by Ninjursu. Genealogical language. But the most famous ruler of Lagash is Gudea, around 2124 BC. We have 27 surviving statues of Gudea. We have his massive building cylinders, Cylinder A and Cylinder B, sitting in the Louvre today, over 1,400 lines of text total, documenting his divine selection and his reconstruction of Ninjursu's temple. Gudea describes himself as a shepherd chosen by the god. He receives the temple plans in a dream, directly from Ninjursu. The text preserves the entire process: the dream, the consultation with a dream interpreter, the gathering of materials from distant lands, the construction itself. And throughout, Gudea emphasizes his genealogy. He connects himself to the earlier rulers of Lagash, documents his parentage, establishes his legitimacy. Through bloodline, the priest-king model reaches its peak in Lagash. Gudea is simultaneously political ruler and high priest. There's no separation. Divine authority and political authority are unified in a person whose right to both comes from ancestry. Dynasty number 6, the dynasty of Umma. Umma was Lagash's rival, fighting over the same border territory for generations. Multiple kings of Umma are documented in conflict inscriptions. We know their names because Lagash's kings recorded defeating them, and because Umma's own inscriptions brag about victories over Lagash. Umma claimed divine patronage from the god Shar, son of Inanna. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma wasn't just political, it was theological. Each city claimed its patron deity, granted it legitimate authority over the disputed territory. Each claimed its ruling family carried divine mandate through bloodline. The disputes were resolved through warfare, diplomacy, and occasionally through intervention by more powerful kings. But the language used in treaties and boundary stones always emphasized legitimacy through divine connection. You couldn't just claim territory. You had to claim divine right to the territory, which meant claiming the proper bloodline. Dynasty number 7, the dynasty of Adab. Adab is briefer. 2 kings documented in the king list, ruling from central Mesopotamia. One of them, Lugalanimundu, left inscriptions claiming to rule from the lower sea to the upper sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. That's almost certainly exaggeration, but the claim itself is significant. Why would a minor dynasty claim universal rule? Because legitimate authority, in Mesopotamian conception, should be universal. The proper king, the one with the correct bloodline, shouldn't rule just one city. He should rule the world. Every dynasty that arose aspired to universal empire, because universal empire is what kingship meant when it first descended from heaven. That ambition, the drive toward universal rule, becomes important when we trace these bloodlines forward. The families who believed they carried divine mandate didn't think small. They thought in terms of world domination, because that's what their ancestry entitled them to. Dynasty number 8, the dynasty of Mary. Mary is fascinating because it sits on the upper Euphrates River in Syria, at the edge of the Mesopotamian world. But Mary's rulers adopted Sumerian culture wholesale. They wrote in Sumerian, worshipped Sumerian gods, and most importantly claimed descent from the flood survivors. The royal archives of Mary, 25,000 cuneiform tablets discovered in the 1930s and still being published today, document one of the most extensively preserved ancient palace administrations we have. The tablets include diplomatic correspondence, economic records, religious texts, and genealogies. Mary maintained its own king lists, claiming continuity with Mesopotamian royal traditions. When more powerful kingdoms conquered Mary, they didn't destroy its archives. They preserved them, because Mary's genealogical records supported their own legitimacy claims. The pattern repeats. Even distant dynasties on the periphery of the Mesopotamian heartland adopted and preserved the bloodline framework. Dynasty number 9, the Akkadian dynasty. In 2334 BC, everything changes. Sargon of Akkad unifies Mesopotamia by force, creating history's first empire. He conquers from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Exactly what Lugalanimundu had only claimed. Sargon's origin story is preserved in legend, born to a priestess who couldn't keep him, set adrift in a basket on the river, raised by a gardener, becoming cupbearer to the king of Kish, overthrowing his master and seizing power. It's the story of an outsider, a man who shouldn't have power according to bloodline. But that's not how Sargon presented himself once he had power. His inscriptions claim divine selection. He presents his rise as fulfillment of divine plan, and crucially, he connects himself to the existing power structure through his position at Kish. He doesn't claim to overturn the system. He claims to restore it after his predecessor failed in his responsibilities. If kingship were just a human institution that received divine blessing, you wouldn't describe its origin this way. You'd say the first king was crowned or anointed or chosen. You'd use human political language. But the text treats kingship as something external to humanity, something that exists independent of human society, something that was brought to earth from somewhere else. This is where interpretation diverges. Mainstream scholarship says it's mythological language. The Sumerians were explaining the origin of political authority using their available conceptual framework, which was religious. Descended from heaven means has divine sanction. It's metaphorical. And that's a reasonable interpretation. Lots of ancient societies described human institutions in divine terms. But there's a problem. The Sumerians used metaphorical language all the time. And we can recognize it because they use different grammatical structures. When they wrote poetry, it looks like poetry, full of similes, epithets, repetition, and symbolic imagery. When they wrote hymns, they look like hymns. The king list doesn't read like poetry. It reads like an administrative document: kings, cities, reign lengths, sequence of succession. The only editorial comment in the entire text is an occasional then. Kingship was taken to when explaining transitions. Otherwise, it's just data. And in that data-focused context, kingship descended from heaven uses literal motion vocabulary. So, here's an alternative interpretation, and we're going to keep it on the table alongside the mainstream view. What if they meant it literally? Not literally in the sense of modern physics and spacecraft that's imposing a framework on their language, but literally in the sense that they believe kingship wasn't invented by humans. It came from somewhere else. It was brought by someone or something from outside human society. And that external source transmitted not just the idea of kingship, but something physical, a quality, a substance, a genetic element, to certain families. Those families became the ruling class. Their children inherited kingship not because they inherited political connections or wealth, but because they inherited whatever physical substance carried the mandate. In ancient terminology, divine blood. In modern terminology, maybe something genetic. This interpretation explains things the metaphorical reading doesn't fully account for. First, why the obsessive Genealogical documentation. If kingship is just divine approval, then each king needs to prove the gods approve of him personally. But if kingship is inherited bloodline, then each king needs to prove his parentage. And what do we see in the records? Obsessive documentation of parentage. Father, mother, grandparents documented across generations. That's genetic thinking. Second, why fractions of divinity? Gilgamesh being 2/3 divine only makes sense if divinity is quantifiable and inherited. You can't be 2/3 blessed or 2/3 chosen, but you can be 2/3 descended from divine ancestors if your bloodline is mixed. Third, why post-flood decline? The rain links dropping from 28,800 years to 1,200 years to 600 years to eventually. Human parameters suggests dilution with each generation further from the original divine-human mixture. The divine component weakens. That's how genetics work, dilution throughout crossing. Fourth, why marriage restrictions? Mesopotamian royal families practiced sibling marriage, half-sibling marriage, and cousin marriage at rates far above the general population. Why? The standard explanation is to keep wealth and power concentrated. But there's another explanation to keep bloodlines concentrated. If your claim to authority is genetic, you can't afford to dilute the bloodline by marrying commoners. Fifth, why conquerors needed genealogical legitimacy. If kingship were just whoever holds power, then conquest would be sufficient. But every conqueror tried to marry into the previous royal families, or claim descent from them. They understood that power without pedigree was unstable. And sixth, why the language is consistent across independent sources. The king list isn't the only text claiming descent from heaven. Royal inscriptions, temple hymns, private letters, economic documents across thousands of tablets. From dozens of cities over 1,000 years, the same concepts appear. Genealogy matters. Divine ancestry is quantifiable. Bloodline determines right to rule. That's not poetic metaphor. That's systematic belief. Now, what was actually descending from heaven? 3 frameworks, same as before. Framework 1. Symbolic interpretation. Heaven means divine realm, a spiritual concept. Descent means the gods chose to establish human kingship as their system for organizing society. The early kings were shamans or religious leaders whose spiritual authority evolved into political authority. Divine blood is metaphor for divine favor transmitted through cultural legitimacy rather than biology. Framework 2. Advanced human interpretation. Heaven might refer to the mountains where an advanced pre-flood civilization lived, mountains being literally higher, closer to the sky. Descent means that elite refugees from this advanced civilization came down to the Mesopotamian plain after their mountain civilization was destroyed by the flood. They brought sophisticated knowledge, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, political organization which seemed divine to the locals. The Sumerians weren't wrong to say kingship came from outside. It did come from outside their society, brought by technological superiors who then intermarried with local populations. Divine blood is the genetic heritage of this advanced human population, possibly conferring actual advantages in intelligence or leadership capacity. Framework 3. Non-human intervention. Interpretation. Heaven means sky in the literal sense. Descent means arrival from space, another dimension, or another developmental track on Earth itself. The Anunnaki were non-human intelligences, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or perhaps an advanced terrestrial species that developed parallel to humans. They genetically engineered or hybridized with humans to create a ruling class that would manage civilization according to their design. Divine blood is literal hybrid genetics, mixing human and non-human DNA in ways that conferred unusual abilities and required careful preservation through controlled breeding. Each framework has evidence supporting it and problems with it. What we're documenting is the belief system itself that these 12 dynasties understood their authority as coming from inherited bloodline connected to non-human or superhuman origins. Whether they were correct, delusional, or encoding something else in genetic-sounding language, the beliefs shaped their behavior. They documented genealogies obsessively. They married within restricted circles. They treated bloodline as the foundation of legitimate authority. And they passed this system forward. When we trace these 12 bloodlines westward through the Hittites, through Troy, through Rome, through medieval European nobility to modern royal families and elite dynasties, we're not tracing mythology. We're tracing a system of power based on ancestry. Whether the ancestry actually traces back to non-human origins, or whether powerful families simply claim it does, the result is the same bloodline determines position. And if you think that system ended with the ancient world, the next chapter is going to surprise you. The flood is genealogical, they said. We need to understand what the flood meant to this system. Because the flood isn't just a catastrophe. It's a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck, and a genealogical reset. Multiple Mesopotamian texts describe it. The king list gives it one line, then the flood swept over The Ritter Genesis preserved on tablet CBS 2673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum describes the gods deciding to destroy humanity, with Enki warnings I Sutra. The Atrahasis epic on tablets in the British Museum gives the most detail. In Atrahasis, humanity has become too numerous and too noisy. The gods can't sleep. They decide to eliminate the problem through a series of catastrophes: plague, drought, and finally flood. But Enki, who was involved in creating humans in the first place, warns his favorite, Atrahasis. His name means exceedingly wise. Enki tells Atrahasis to build a boat, bring animals, bring his family, bring the craftsmen who know important skills survive. The flood comes. Everyone else dies. After the waters recede, Atrahasis makes an offering. The gods, who apparently didn't think through the consequences of eliminating their workforce, are delighted by the scent of the sacrifice. They realize they need humans after all. They bless Atrahasis and his family and send them to repopulate the world. The Ritter Genesis is similar. Sutra is warned. He survives. He receives immortality and divine status afterward. Now, why preserve this story? What's it actually documenting? On the surface, it's an explanation for the obvious catastrophic floods happened in Mesopotamia. The archaeological evidence is clear. Multiple cities show flood deposits around 2900 BC. Something big happened. But look at what the story emphasizes: selective survival. The flood doesn't wipe out humanity randomly. It wipes out everyone except one family. And that family isn't chosen randomly. It's chosen specifically by one of the creator gods. The family that carried the best genetic heritage, the closest connection to the divine mixing, is preserved intentionally. After the flood, that family becomes the ancestor of all subsequent humanity, or at least all subsequent humanity that matters. The royal families, the ones documented in the king list, all claim descent from the flood survivor. This is genealogical bottleneck thinking. In modern genetics, we understand bottlenecks. If a population crashes and only a few individuals survive, all subsequent genetic diversity comes from those survivors. If you want to trace ancestry in a post-bottleneck population, you trace back to the bottleneck survivors. The flood narrative describes exactly this. This without modern terminology. Before the flood, widespread population, with varying degrees of divine ancestry. After the flood, one family carrying the most concentrated divine bloodline. All legitimate post-flood rulers descend from that family. This is why post-flood dynasties claim two sources of authority. First, descent from the pre-flood divine unions. Through the flood survivor, they maintain genetic connection to the antediluvian world. Second, the renewed descent of kingship from heaven. The king list says kingship descended again after the flood. This suggests the external entities who established kingship originally returned after the catastrophe to re-establish it. The system was rebooted, but it wasn't rebooted randomly. It was rebooted through a carefully preserved bloodline. Now, is this history or mythology? Let's look at what we can verify. First, catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia. Around 2900 BC is geological fact. Excavations at Kish, Shurapak, and other sites found sterile flood deposits between occupation layers. The flood wasn't global, no evidence for that, but it devastated the Mesopotamian heartland. To anyone living there, it would have seemed world-ending. Second, flood narratives are nearly universal across ancient cultures. Not just Mesopotamia, the biblical Noah, the Hindu Manu, the Greek Deucalion, Native American flood myths, Polynesian flood myths. The similarities are striking. Divine warning to one righteous man, boat, animals, survival, repopulation. Third, many of these narratives emphasize that the survivors become the ancestors of subsequent nobility. It's not just about humanity surviving. It's about the right humans surviving. The mainstream interpretation, universal folk memory of local flooding events, plus convergent evolution of the myth to explain civilization's origins. The alternative interpretation, these narratives preserve distorted memory of an actual catastrophic event around 2900 BC that disrupted but didn't destroy an earlier advanced civilization. The survivors of that civilization became the ruling class in the post-catastrophe world, and their descendant families preserve the memory of surviving through selective preservation. Either way, what matters for our investigation is how this narrative shaped subsequent behavior. The post-flood dynasties believe they descended from flood survivors. They documented it. They used it to justify their authority, and they structured their marriage patterns to maintain that ancestral connection. Look at the pattern. Dynasty of Kish claims first post-flood kingship, implying direct connection to survivors. Dynasty of Ur, Gilgamesh's quest to find Utnapishtim to learn the secret of immortality. The epic treats Utnapishtim as Gilgamesh's distant ancestor, same bloodline separated by time. Dynasty of Ur, royal genealogies trace back to the first post-flood generations. Dynasty of Mary, explicit claims in Mary texts to Descent from flood survivors. Every major dynasty makes a claim, and they don't treat it as poetic or symbolic. They treat it as the legal foundation of their right to rule. When we move forward to later empires, the pattern continues. The Hittites, who conquer Anatolia in the 2nd millennium BC, adopt Mesopotamian myths wholesale, including the flood narrative. Their royal family claims descent from the same sources. The Persians, when they conquer Mesopotamia in 539 BC, preserve the genealogical records. Cyrus the Great presents himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a restorer of legitimate order. His inscriptions honor the Mesopotamian gods and claim the gods chose him to liberate Babylon from its unworthy rulers. He positions himself within the existing legitimacy framework. Alexander the Great, conquering Persia in 331 BC, does the same. He goes to the temple of Marduk in Babylon and presents himself as Marduk's chosen instrument. He claims connection to the ancient bloodlines through supposed descent from Heracles, who Greek mythology linked to Eastern origins. The pattern is unbreakable. Every conqueror who successfully holds power in Mesopotamia connects himself to the original bloodlines or preserves the records of those bloodlines, and those records are transmitted westward. When the Seleucid Greeks rule Mesopotamia after Alexander's death, they commission Berossus, a Babylonian priest, to compile Mesopotamian history in Greek. Berossus writes the Babyloniaca around 290 BC, translating the king list and flood narratives for a Greek audience. This is how Mesopotamian genealogical claims entered the Greek intellectual world and through Greek influence reach Rome. Roman patrician families claim Trojan origins. Troy sits in Anatolia in the Hittite cultural sphere. The Hittites documented marriage alliances with Mesopotamian royal families. We have the tablets. The genealogical chain connects. And here's what's remarkable. When we look at modern genetic studies of European elite populations, we find evidence consistent with these genealogical claims. But before we jump forward to genetics and modern families, we need to establish something crucial. We need to look at what Mesopotamian texts say about how these bloodlines were created in the first place. Because if the flood was a genetic bottleneck preserving certain lineages, we need to understand what made those lineages special. We need to talk about blood, clay, and what the Mesopotamians believed divine essence actually was. Blood, clay, and divine essence. The creation of humanity in Mesopotamian texts isn't like Genesis. There's no let us make man in our image followed by dust and breath. The Mesopotamian accounts are procedural. They read like laboratory notes. The Atrahasis epic, which we've already mentioned for its flood account, opens with creation. The text is preserved on multiple tablets in the British Museum, particularly BM 78941. Here's what it describes. In the beginning, there are gods, the Anunnaki, and there were lesser gods called the Gigi. The Gigi do all the hard work. Digging canals, building cities, maintaining infrastructure. They do this for 2,500 years. Then they revolt. They burn their tools, surround the house of Enlil, the metal god, and refuse to work anymore. The gods convene a council. What do? We can't do the work ourselves. We're gods. But the Gigi are right that the labor is unbearable. Enki, the wise god, proposes a solution: create a substitute worker. Fashion a new being specifically designed to bear the toil of the gods. The gods agree. But how? The text is specific. One god must be slaughtered. The god chosen is Jesu. His name means ear or wisdom. He has personality or intelligence. The Akkadian word is Timu. Jesu is killed. His blood is collected. The birth goddess Nintu, also called Nim or Bel Tili in different texts, mixes his blood with clay taken from the Asu, the underground freshwater ocean that in Mesopotamian cosmology lies beneath the earth. The mixture is then used to form humans. 14 are created, 7 male, 7 female. The text specifies that Nintu pinches off pieces of the mixture and forms them. It says she uses a brick mold, the same tool used for making mud bricks, to give them shape. The creator goddess says, I have removed your heavy work. I have imposed your toil on man. And then this line you called out for humanity. I have loosened the bond. I have granted you freedom. The gods celebrate. The Gigi are released from labor. Humans are put to work. The text then specifies the birth process. The divine clay mixer is placed in divine wombs. Goddesses serve as surrogates, and after 10 lunar months, humans are born. Now, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets, including K5419 in the British Museum, tells a similar, but compressed story. After Marduk defeats the primordial goddess Tiamat and creates the cosmos from her body, he addresses the problem of divine labor. Let me put blood together and make bone. Let me set up primeval man. Man shall be his name. Let me create a primeval man. The work of the gods shall be imposed on him so that they may be at leisure. The gods debate whose blood to use. They settle on Kingu, Tiamat's consort, who led a rebellion. Kingu is executed. Enki's Babylonian name creates humans from his blood. Out of his blood, they fashion mankind. He imposed the service and let free the gods. So we have two accounts, separated by centuries in different cities, telling the same basic story. Humans were created deliberately by mixing divine blood with clay. The purpose was to create workers. The method was genetic, mixing divine substance with earthly material. The result was a hybrid, partly divine, the blood, partly earthly, the clay. Now let's think about what this means for royal bloodlines. If all humans were created from one God's blood mixed with clay, then theoretically all humans have divine ancestry. But the text specified that only one God was killed. His blood was divided among the clay to create multiple humans. So from the start, there's dilution. If Jesu's blood is divided among 14 humans, each human is maybe 510% divine blood, 9,095% clay. But what if some humans maintained higher concentrations? What if the royal families, the ones who became the ruling class, were created with less dilution? But what if, after initial creation, certain humans mated with additional Anunnaki, increasing the divine percentage in their bloodlines? This is exactly what other Mesopotamian texts describe. The myth of Enki and Ninmah describes creation as trial and error. Multiple versions of humans are created, some defective, some functional, suggesting experimental iteration. The Epic of Gilgamesh explicitly states that Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, on a third human. That ratio only makes sense if divinity is quantifiable and hereditary. Multiple myths describe Anunnaki taking human lovers and producing hybrid offspring in Anna and Dumuzi, Enlil, and various human women. Enki's numerous affairs with mortals. The pattern across texts: humans start with some divine component from creation, but royal families maintain or increase the divine percentage through continued mixing with Anunnaki. This creates a hereditary caste system based on blood percentage. Common humans, 510% divine from the original creation mixture. Royal families, 3,070% divine from continued divine-human unions. Semi-divine heroes, 5,075% divine, like Gilgamesh at 2/3. Full Anunnaki, 100% divine. The royal families maintain their status by controlling marriage. Marry within the royal class and you maintain high divine percentage. Marry commoners and you dilute it. This explains the obsessive endogamy sibling marriage, cousin marriage, restricted marriage pools. They're protecting genetic concentration. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The Atrahasis epic says Jesu was chosen specifically because he had Timu intelligence, personality, wisdom. His blood carried these qualities. When mixed with clay to create humans, those qualities were transferred. In modern terms, genetic information. Blood carries DNA. DNA encodes traits. Traits are inherited. The Mesopotamians didn't have the vocabulary of genetics, but they described something that behaves exactly like genetic inheritance qualities carried in blood, passed from parents to children, diluted by outcrossing, concentrated by controlled breeding. Were they describing actual genetics? Using the conceptual framework available to them. Framework 1: No, it's pure mythology. Blood and clay are symbolic. The divine-human mixture is a metaphor for humans having both material bodies and spiritual consciousness. The royal bloodline claims are social constructs, elite families claiming special ancestry to justify their power. Framework 2: They're describing genetic engineering by an advanced human civilization that preceded the Sumerians. Divine blood means genetic material from this technologically superior population. Clay means baseline human genetics. The mixing describes hybridization or genetic modification. The resulting humans had advantages: intelligence, leadership capacity, longer lifespan, inherited from the divine, actually advanced genetic donors. Framework 3: They're describing literal hybridization between non-human entities and terrestrial humans. Divine blood is non-human DNA. The mixing produced fertile hybrids, uncommon in biology, but not impossible, especially if deliberate genetic engineering was involved. The royal families descend from these hybrids and preserve the non-human genetic component through controlled breeding. What we can say with certainty: the Mesopotamians treated bloodline as biological, not merely social. They documented it with the precision they applied to every other quantifiable resource. And they structured their entire civilization around maintaining specific bloodlines and positions of power. The priest-king system, which we'll examine next, operationalized this belief. Religious authority and political authority were unified in families who claimed biological connection to the divine, not symbolic connection. Biological connection inherited through blood, documented through genealogy, preserved through controlled marriage. This system didn't end in ancient Mesopotamia. It was transmitted forward, adapted, and arguably continues today in modified form. Before we trace it forward, geographically, let's see how it functioned at its peak. The priest, king's double crown. Power in Mesopotamia wasn't divided between church and state. That separation is a modern Western concept that would have made no sense to ancient Mesopotamians. Religious authority and political authority flowed from the same source bloodline, and they were held by the same people. The priest-king model reaches its clearest expression in Lagash dynasty. Number 5 of our 12. We need to spend time on this because it demonstrates how the bloodline system actually functioned. This isn't abstract theory. It's documented in thousands of tablets. Nippur was the religious center of Mesopotamia, not the capital. Kingship moved between cities, but the sacred center Nippur was where the temple of Enlil stood. Enlil was, for most of Mesopotamian history, the supreme deity. King of the gods, controller of destinies. Control Nippur's temple and you have religious legitimacy across all of Mesopotamia. The temple administration at Nippur was hereditary. Specific families held specific offices passed from father to son across generations. We know this because the Nippur archives thousands of tablets excavated by the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1800s and early 1900s document the system in extraordinary detail. One family in particular is extensively documented, the Murashu family. They held a hereditary prebend, a temple office that came with income, authority, and responsibilities at Enlil's temple. The prebend functioned like property. You inherited it. You could divide it among your sons. You could, in extreme circumstances, sell it, though that was discouraged. The crucial point: religious offices were owned through bloodline. The Murashu family's records span at least 6 generations, around 21,001,900 BC. Tablets document which family member held which office, how much barley and silver each received as income, which family members substituted for each other during illness or travel, succession disputes resolved by presenting genealogical proof of descent, marriages between the Murashu family and other priestly families, creating alliances. This wasn't about religious calling or spiritual worthiness. This was about inheritance. You could serve as priest because your father was priest, because his father was priest, tracing back to whenever the family first received the prebend. And this system wasn't unique to Nippur. Every major temple in every major city operated the same way. Priestly offices were hereditary, bloodline determined. They could serve the gods. Now, in some cities, religious and political authority was separated. The king ruled politically. The high priests ruled religiously. They were different people from different families. But in Lagash, they were the same person. Deity of Lagash, around 21,442,124 BC, held the title NC governor or ruler, but he also functioned as high priest of Ninjutsu. Lagash's patron deity. His inscriptions describe both political and religious responsibilities without distinguishing them. We have 27 statues of Gudea surviving in museums around the world. Most show him in a pose of prayerful devotion, wearing a distinctive headdress. The inscriptions on these statues document his temple building, his offerings, his divine communications. The most extensive texts are the Gudea cylinders, Cylinder A and Cylinder B, sitting today in the Louvre. Combined, they contain over 1,400 lines of cuneiform, documenting Gudea's reconstruction of the Ininu temple of Ninjutsu. The text describes the process. Gudea receives a dream. In the dream, Ninjutsu appears and shows him the temple plan. Gudea doesn't fully understand the dream, so he consults a dream interpreter. The interpreter explains Ninjutsu has chosen Gudea to rebuild the temple and has revealed the architectural plan. Gudea gathers materials from across the known world: cedar from Lebanon, gold from Egypt, carnelian from Malaha, possibly the Indus Valley. The text lists everything in an accountant's detail, not poetic vagueness, but specific quantities and sources. The temple is built exactly to the divine specifications. Ninjutsu is pleased. Gudea is blessed. Throughout the text, Gudea emphasizes his genealogy. He connects himself to earlier rulers of Lagash-Urnensh, Enidim. He documents his parentage. He establishes that he holds authority through bloodline, not just personal achievement. And crucially, the text describes Gudea's selection in genealogical terms. Ninjutsu looked with favor upon the family of Gudea, not on Gudea individually, on his family, his bloodline. The same pattern appears in inscriptions from other priest kings. Enidim of Lagash, a generation before Gudea, left the stele of the vultures describing his victory over Amma. The inscription states he is the seed implanted by Ninjutsu in the womb. Seed implanted. That's biological language. Not blessed. Not chosen, implanted. As if Ninjutsu personally ensured Enidim's conception. As if the divine bloodline was literal. This brings us to the sacred marriage ritual. In multiple Mesopotamian cities, the king participated in an annual ritual called the sacred marriage Sumerian Hieros Gamos. The king, representing Dumuzi, the shepherd. God, ritually mated with the high priestess representing Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. Mainstream interpretation sympathetic. Magic. The ritual ensures fertility of the land by symbolically reenacting the divine marriage. Alternative interpretation. The ritual maintained the divine bloodline. If royal authority derives from divine ancestry, then periodically reintroducing divine genetics or ceremonially affirming the existing divine genetics would strengthen the claim. The high priestess was unjust, representing the goddess symbolically. She embodied the divine feminine and union with her past divine essence to the king or confirmed his existing divine nature. We can't prove which interpretation is correct, but we can observe the pattern. Religious ritual, political authority, and bloodline maintenance were inseparable. The king was high priest because his bloodline gave him access to the divine realm. He could mediate between gods and humans because he carried both natures. Politically, this meant his decisions had divine sanction. Economically, it meant temple resources and state resources were managed by the same family. Socially, it meant challenging the king was challenging the gods. The system was totalizing. Bloodline determined everything. And the system was documented obsessively because genealogical proof was legal necessity. If you claimed priestly office, you had to prove descent from the family that owned the prebend. If you claimed kingship, you had to prove descent from previous kings who carried divine ancestry. Thousands of tablets exist, preserved in the dry Mesopotamian soil, excavated over the past 150 years, documenting family trees. Temple archives kept these records alongside economic accounts because they served the same function, proving ownership. You owned land through inheritance. You owned slaves through purchase. And you owned authority through bloodline. When we trace the 12 dynasties forward through time, we're not tracing mythology or vague claims. We're tracing a documented system of hereditary power that operated continuously for over 1,000 years in Mesopotamia, before being exported to successor civilizations. The Hittites adopted it. The Persians adopted it. The Greeks under the Seleucids adopted it. The Romans already had a version of it and recognized the Mesopotamian system is compatible with their own patrician bloodline consciousness. And as that system moved west through conquest, trade, diplomatic, marriage, migration, the families carrying it maintained their genealogical documentation. Medieval European abilities obsession with heraldry, bloodline, and succession law isn't a medieval invention. It's the continuation of a system established 5,000 years earlier in Mesopotamia. But before we trace the westward transmission in detail, we need to look at the physical evidence these dynasties left. Because these weren't just claims in texts. These dynasties marked their divine ancestry in stone and seal. They made it public. They made it official. They made it legally binding. Markers in stone and seal. If you were a merchant in ancient Mesopotamia, every contract you signed was sealed. Not sealed with wax like in medieval Europe, sealed with a cylinder seal. Rolled across wet clay. Cylinder seals were small stone cylinders, usually an inch or two long, carved with a design in reverse. When rolled across clay, they left a positive impression. Each seal was unique, functioning as a signature. The design identified the seal's owner, and rolling your seal onto a document meant you were legally bound to whatever that document said. For commoners, cylinder seals might show simple scenes, animals, plants, geometric patterns. For elites, seals showed much more: the owner's name and cuneiform, their title, their patron deity, and often a scene of the owner meeting or receiving blessing from that deity. For royalty, cylinder seals were declarations of divine ancestry. The Metropolitan Museum in New York, the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Oriental Institute in Chicago all held extensive collections of Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and the royal seals follow a consistent pattern. The king stands before deity. The deity extends symbols of authority, sometimes a rod and ring representing measuring tools, hence justice and order. Sometimes a symbolic plant, sometimes a weapon. The scene establishes this king receives his authority from this god. But the postures and proportions are revealing. The king isn't groveling before a distant transcendent god. The king and deity are often shown at nearly the same scale. The interaction is direct, sometimes almost casual, and frequently the imagery includes symbols suggesting kinship: the king wearing horned crowns, reserved for deities, or divine symbols appearing above the king's head as if claiming identity rather than just favor. Example: seal of Renamu, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. The seal shows Renamu receiving the rod and ring from the moon god Nana. Renamu wears the horned crown. He's labeled with the divine determinative, the little cuneiform marker that goes before God's names. This seal was rolled onto official documents, treaties, building dedications, legal decrees. Every time, the impression declared this king is divine. His authority flows from Nana, his divine father. Now let's look at monuments. Naram-Sin of Akkad commissioned the Victory Stele now in the Louvre, celebrating his conquest of the Balubi people around 2250 BC. The stele shows Naram-Sin ascending a mountain. His soldiers below him, defeated enemies at his feet. He's larger than everyone else scale, indicating importance. And he wears the horned crown. Before Naram-Sin, that crown appears only on deities in Mesopotamian art. It's how you identify a god in a relief or statue. Count the horns. More horns mean higher rank in the divine hierarchy. Naram-Sin puts it on his own head. The inscription calls him god of Akkad using the divine determinative. Before his name Naram-Sin, not king who serves the gods, not king chosen by the gods, God. Full stop. Mainstream history. Naram-Sin suffered from hubris. He overstepped. Later Mesopotamian tradition remembered his reign as troubled rebellions, invasions, disasters which they attributed to divine punishment for his arrogance. Alternative interpretation. Naram-Sin understood what his bloodline actually was. If the Akkadian dynasty had successfully concentrated divine ancestry through his grandfather Sargon's conquest and his father's marriages to daughters of the old dynasties, and if his aunt Enheduanna's position as high priestess had further confirmed the family's divine status, then maybe Naram-Sin reached the threshold. Maybe he had sufficient divine blood percentage to justify the crown and the title. Whether he was right or delusional, the important fact is the claim itself. He didn't claim divine favor. He claimed divine nature. And he proclaimed it publicly on monuments that stood in city centers where everyone could see. And here's what's fascinating. Temples were built to Naram-Sin during his lifetime. We have tablets documenting offerings made to the god Naram-Sin, prayers addressed to him, petitioning him for protection and blessings. This wasn't private belief. This wasn't metaphor. This was state religion. Official cult worship of the living king as god. Shulgi, a century later, did the same. Royal hymns composed in his name, whether he wrote them or commissioned them, they represent official claims to describe his divine birth. I, Shulgi, the noble king, was born of the divine. The august god Nana begot me. The god past tense of beget, too. Father, child. Nana is Shulgi's biological father. These hymns weren't private documents. They were performed in temples. They were copied and recopied by scribal schools. They were official statements of the dynasty's nature. And, again, Shulgi's claims weren't rejected by his contemporaries. No rebellion overthrew him for blasphemy. No priests denounced him. The system accepted that sufficiently concentrated divine bloodline conferred divine status. Now let's look at Gudea of Lagash, who we've already mentioned. 27. Surviving statues. Most are in the Louvre, with others scattered in museums worldwide. They're all similar. Gudea seated or standing, hands clasped in prayer, wearing a distinctive rounded cap with inscriptions documenting his piety and temple building. The inscriptions emphasize selection. Ninjutsu chose Gudea because of his family line. One text states, since the days of old, the god Ninjutsu has looked favorably upon the house of Gudea, the house of Gudea. His family, his lineage. Divine favor is genealogical, not individual. Gudea didn't claim full divinity like Naram-Sin and Shulgi. He positioned himself as devoted servant. But the distinction might be one of emphasis, rather than kind. Gudea's dynasty in Lagash wasn't empire building like Akkad. Or Lagash was a city-state, and Gudea's strategy for maintaining independence was emphasizing piety, rather than power. But the underlying claim is the same. His right to rule flows from his bloodline's connection to the divine. The physical evidence is everywhere, not hidden in esoteric texts, not whispered in secret ceremonies carved in stone, rolled on legal documents, displayed in public monuments, sung in temple hymns. The ancient Mesopotamians weren't lying about their belief system. They genuinely understood political authority as flowing from divine bloodline. They documented it in every medium available, and they passed that documentation forward. When the Hittites conquered Anatolia, they adopted Mesopotamian artistic conventions, including divine kingship imagery. Hittite king reliefs show kings meeting gods in the same direct manner, receiving authority, wearing divine symbols. When the Persians conquered Mesopotamia, they preserved Mesopotamian monuments. Cyrus the Great didn't destroy Naram-Sin's stele. He looted it and moved it to Susa as a prize, recognizing its importance. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he went to Babylon and presented himself at Marduk's temple as the god's chosen instrument. He understood that legitimacy in the region required claiming connection to the ancient divine bloodline framework. And Seleucid kings ruling after Alexander's death commissioned Berossus to translate Mesopotamian records into Greek, specifically to document their claim to legitimate succession. The system was transmitted westward not as mythology but as constitutional foundation. The right to rule depends on ancestry, and ancestry must be documented, publicly claimed, and legally certified. When we look at European Heraldry coats of arms displaying genealogical connections, royal seals showing divine right, coronation ceremonies involving religious anointing. We're seeing the same system modified, adapted to different cultural contexts, but fundamentally the same bloodline determines authority, and authority must be marked and proven. The direct line from Mesopotamian cylinder seals showing kings meeting gods to medieval royal seals showing kings crowned by Christ is traceable. The iconography changed, the names changed, the underlying logic didn't. Now let's look at how that system was maintained with mathematical precision. The mathematics of succession. The third dynasty of dynasty number 11 of R12 represents the peak of Mesopotamian record keeping, and that record keeping gives us unprecedented insight into how bloodlines were actually managed. We have 120,000 administrative tablets from the R3 period. That's not an estimate. That's the count of tablets sitting in museums and university collections today, primarily from excavations at Nippur, Amma, Durham, and other R3 administrative centers. Scholars estimate that surviving tablets represent 12% of the original archive. Do the math. If 120,000 is 1%, then the original archive contains 6 million tablets. Even at 2% survival rate, we're talking 3 million original documents. The R3 state documented everything: grain rations distributed to workers, textile production quotas, livestock transfers between temple herds, beer brewing, bricks manufactured, labor assignments for canal maintenance, tax collection, trade with foreign merchants, and royal family genealogy. Among the economic tablets are documents tracking the royal family itself, not occasionally, systematically. The system tracked the king's sons and daughters by name, in birth order, which wife bore which child, marriages of royal daughters to provincial governors, appointments of royal sons to governorships and military commands, rations allocated to royal family members, births of grandchildren, deaths, and succession. Let's trace one lineage in detail. When Amu founds the dynasty in 2112 BC, his son Shulgi succeeds him in 2094 BC. Tablets document Shulgi's appointment as crown prince before Amu's death, establishing clear succession. Shulgi rules for 48 years, an extraordinarily long reign for the period. He has multiple wives and at least 6 documented children. Tablets track his sons' careers. Emerson, the eldest surviving son, one earlier son appears to have died young, is appointed governor of Ur while Shulgi is still alive, training for kingship. Shulgi dies in 2047 BC. Emerson. The change in power happens without any arguments. Records written on clay tablets from that time prove the change happened. Amron rules as king for 9 years. Tablets show that his son and also his brother Shuan were both possible choices to be the next king. Amron dies in 2038 BC. His brother Shuan becomes king, not his son. Why did this happen? The tablets don't tell us directly, but the rules about who becomes king from this time period give us clues. Age and ability mattered. If Amarsin's son was too young, the kingdom would go to Amron's brother to keep things stable. Shuan rules for 9 years. Tablets show his son Ibeson being prepared to rule. Shusan dies in 2029 BC. Ibeson becomes the next king, this time from father to son again. Ibeson rules until the dynasty falls when the Elamites invade in 2004 BC. 5 kings, 4 times the power changed hands, all written down, all within the same family. No one took over by force. No outside family seized control. 90 years of unbroken family rule. The system does more than just write down who becomes king. It actively manages the family bloodline through marriage. Shai's daughters married governors of major cities like Susa, Ishnuna, and Anan. Tablets document the wedding gifts, the dowries, and the ongoing relationship between the royal house and these local governors, who are now connected by family ties. Why marry daughters to governors? The standard explanation is political alliance. Governors who are connected to the king through marriage are less likely to rebel. But there's also a genetic explanation. They're spreading the royal bloodline. Each princess who marries a governor has children who carry royal blood. Those children hold positions of power in their provinces. Over time, you create a network of related families, all carrying royal ancestry, all interested in keeping the system going. It's not just about loyalty. It's about creating a genetic web. Let's calculate. If Shai has 6 children and each of them has 6 children, that's 36 grandchildren. If each grandchild has 6 children, that's 216 great-grandchildren. Over 4 generations, a single king produces hundreds of descendants if the family is carefully managing reproduction. Now, most of those descendants aren't kings, but they're all royal family. They fill the officer positions. They run provincial administrations. They serve as temple officials. They marry into local elite families, spreading royal ancestry even further. Within 3 or 4 generations, every elite family in the empire has some royal blood. The difference between royal and noble becomes a matter of how much, not whether you have it. The entire system depends on documentation because your position in society, your access to office, your marriage options, and your economic rights depend on proving your family tree. This is why temple archives kept family records alongside economic records. They serve the same purpose, proving ownership. You own land through inheritance, documented in legal tablets. You own authority through bloodline, documented in family tree tablets. The standards of documentation were high. Mesopotamian scribes didn't accept vague oral tradition. They wanted names, relationships, and dates. They cross-referenced records. They kept multiple copies in multiple archives for backup. When we say these bloodlines were documented, we're not talking about medieval stories written centuries after the events. We're talking about records created at the time as part of normal government record-keeping. The same scribes who recorded that 4,823 sheep were transferred from Nippur to Drain in month 3 of year 7 of Shuli also recorded that Prince Amran was appointed governor in year 12 of Shuli. Same archive, same standards of documentation. This is why the bloodline claims are historically important. Even if we're not sure what the bloodlines really represent, whether divine-human hybrids, descendants of advanced humans, or simply social constructions, the system for tracking and maintaining them was real, extensive, and effective. The system didn't end with their eyes full. The dynasty of Isin, which came after Ur-3, kept the same documentary practices. The Old Babylonian period that followed continued it. The system was inherited by the Kassites, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Persians. When we get to genetic evidence in later chapters, this documentary foundation matters. We're not relying on vague myths. We're working from thousands of tablets documenting specific families across specific time periods. When we find genetic evidence of Near Eastern admixture in European elite populations, we can potentially match it to specific dynasties, because those dynasties documented themselves so thoroughly. But before we jump to genetics and modern families, we need to address something that makes many people uncomfortable. We need to talk about what the texts say about how these bloodlines were established. We need to talk about divine-human unions, not as metaphor, but as what the texts actually claim. Divine-human unions, the texts and 3 interpretations. This is where the investigation gets difficult. Not because the evidence is weak. The evidence is abundant. But because the claims the evidence makes are extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require careful analysis. We're going to look at what Mesopotamian texts actually say about unions between Anunnaki and humans. Then we're going to present 3 ways to understand those claims. All 3 will be presented fairly because we can't prove which is correct. What we can prove is that the ancient Mesopotamians believed these unions happened, documented them extensively, and built their entire civilization around the resulting bloodlines. What the texts say. Multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe marriages or sexual unions between Anunnaki and humans. Not symbolic unions representing abstract ideas, specific stories with specific characters, specific offspring, and specific family tree consequences. The myth Inanna and Dumuzi describes the goddess Inanna marrying Dumuzi, identified as a shepherd and king of Uruk. The text presents this as a problematic relationship. Inanna's family doesn't approve of her choosing a shepherd, but they eventually marry. The sacred marriage ritual in multiple Mesopotamian cities reenacted this union annually, with the king playing Dumuzi and the high priestess playing Inanna. Enlil and Ninlil describes Enlil pursuing Ninlil. Some versions present Ninlil as a goddess from the start, but other versions suggest she was human or semi-divine before union with Enlil elevated her status. Their union produces Nanna, the moon god. The Epic of Gilgamesh states explicitly that Gilgamesh's mother is Ninsun, a goddess, and his father is Lugalbanta, the previous king of Uruk, who was human or semi-divine. The text is clear: 2/3 of him is god, 1/3 of him is human. That fraction is mathematically specific. If his mother is 100% divine and his father is 50% divine, Gilgamesh is 75% divine, close to 2/3 by Sumerian approximation. Alternatively, if his mother is 100% divine and his father is 33% divine, Gilgamesh is approximately 67% divine, exactly 2/3. The point: the text treats divinity as something you can measure and inherit. It's genetic reasoning. Genesis 614 provides a cross-cultural parallel. When men began to multiply on earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and they took wives from among those that pleased them. The Nephilim appeared on earth in those days, as well as later, after the sons of God had intercourse with the daughters of men, who bore them sons. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. This text comes from Hebrew tradition, not Mesopotamian, but the structure is identical. Divine beings, sons of God, mate with human women, daughters of men. The offspring are different from normal humans, Nephilim, meaning fallen ones or giants. These offspring become the heroes of old, the men of renown, the legendary figures, the founding dynasties. The text places this before the flood, just as the Sumerian king list places divine-human mixing before the flood. Greek mythology is full of heroes born from divine-human unions: Heracles, Zeus and Alcmene, Perseus, Zeus and Danae, Achilles, Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, Helen of Troy, Zeus and Leda. Every major Greek hero claims divine parentage. Norse mythology: the gods intermarry with human royal families. The Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in 1220 C, explicitly states in its prologue that Odin and the Aesir came from Anatolia Troy. That man is named Odin. He was a far-famed man in Turkland. He made ready to journey out of Turkland. Snorri presents the Norse gods as ancient kings who migrated north and were later deified. Their descendants became Scandinavian royalty. This isn't secret knowledge. It's in the official royal mythology. Hindu tradition: the Rig Veda and epic literature describe devas producing children with human royalty. The Ikshaku dynasty claims descent from Surya. The Yadu dynasty claims descent from Chandra. The pattern is global. Ancient cultures describe divine-human mixing, producing hero dynasties who become ruling classes. Now, how do we interpret this pattern? Framework 1: Pure mythology. Position: these narratives are symbolic, not historical. Divine-human unions represent the metaphorical union of spiritual authority and political power. Reasoning: gods are personifications of natural forces or psychological archetypes, not actual entities. Divine blood is metaphor for spiritual legitimacy, not biological inheritance. Fractions like 2/3 divine represent spiritual qualities, not genetic percentages. The narratives encode theological claims about the nature of kingship. Kings mediate between human and divine realms, so mythology presents them as literally bridging the two. Cross-cultural similarities reflect universal human psychology. Every society needs origin stories explaining why certain families rule. Strengths of this framework: fits modern secular worldview. Explains patterns without requiring supernatural entities. Consistent with scholarly consensus on mythology. Weaknesses of this framework: doesn't explain why genealogies were documented with legal precision if bloodline was symbolic. Doesn't explain why legal disputes were resolved through genealogical proof. Doesn't explain why marriage patterns were restricted if bloodline was metaphorical. Doesn't explain the procedural, non-mythological language of creation accounts. Doesn't explain fractional divinity expressions that only make sense mathematically. Doesn't explain why the system persisted for thousands of years across multiple civilizations if it was arbitrary. Framework 2: Advanced human civilization. Position: divine beings were an archaic but technologically culturally advanced human population. Divine blood represents genetic heritage from this advanced population. Reasoning: before the circa 2900 BC flood, an advanced human civilization existed in Mesopotamia or nearby regions. This civilization had sophisticated knowledge: astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, genetics. The catastrophic flood around 2900 BC destroyed much of this civilization, but some survived. Survivors, like Sisudra, relocated to Mesopotamian plain and became ruling class over less advanced populations. To those populations, the survivors seemed divine. They had knowledge and abilities far beyond common experience. Descended from heaven might mean came from the mountains where they survived the flood, or brought knowledge that seemed heavencent. Divine blood is genetic heritage from this technologically superior population, possibly conferring actual advantages in intelligence, health, or leadership capacity. Royal families genuinely descend from this advanced population and preserve the genetic heritage through controlled marriage. The genealogical documentation is accurate history, just using religious vocabulary. Strengths of this framework: explains obsessive genealogical documentation of royal ancestry being preserved. Explains genetic evidence of Near Eastern admixture in elite populations, actual ancient population movements. Explains global similarity of Fluplashero myths, memory of real catastrophe. Explains why mythology contains surprisingly accurate astronomical and geographical information. Explains why conquerors needed to claim genealogical connection, reconnecting to genuinely superior ancestral population. Requires no supernatural elements. Weaknesses of this framework: no clear archaeological evidence for pre-Sumerian advanced civilization in Mesopotamia. Advanced civilization should leave architectural remains, metal artifacts, or other durable traces. If such civilization existed, where did it come from originally? Doesn't fully explain impossible antediluvian reign lengths unless they're coded differently than we understand. Framework 3: Non-human intervention. Position: texts should be read more literally. Anunnaki were non-human intelligences, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or advanced non-human terrestrial species. Divine blood is non-human genetic material. Reasoning: consistent textual claims across multiple independent cultures, describing beings who came from the sky. Sumerian word Anunnaki literally means those who from heaven to earth came. Heaven, Kai, earth, Nak, to come. Physical descriptions in texts sometimes distinguish Anunnaki from humans: taller, radiant, extraordinarily long-lived. Creation accounts like Atrahasis and Enuma Elish describe human creation through mixing divine blood with clay. Reads like genetic engineering documentation. Divine-human unions describe interbreeding between species or genetic manipulation to create hybrid populations. Royal families descend from these hybrids and preserve the non-human genetic component through controlled breeding. The obsessive genealogical documentation isn't paranoia or status-seeking. These families know what's in their blood and why it matters. Antediluvian reign lengths might reflect actual longevity of hybrid individuals before genetic dilution. The system persists because its real modern elite families are aware of their hybrid ancestry and maintain it intentionally. Strengths of this framework. Takes ancient texts at face value, rather than assuming ancient peoples were confused or lying. Explains astronomical knowledge appearing suddenly in Sumerian civilization. Explains why texts use procedural rather than poetic language for creation. Explains fractional divinity, 2/3, as literal hybrid percentages. Explains global pattern of similar myths as global reality rather than coincidence. Explains why bloodline obsession continues in modern elite families despite loss of political power. Weaknesses of this framework. Extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence, which isn't available. No physical evidence, no spacecraft, no alien artifacts, no preserved alien bodies. Interspecies breeding typically impossible biologically, though possibly achievable through genetic engineering. Conflicts with evolutionary biology's understanding of human origins. Requires accepting non-human intelligence interacted with humanity, which has massive implications. Maintaining ambiguity. We cannot definitively prove which framework is correct based on ancient texts alone. What we can prove. Ancient Mesopotamians treated bloodline as biologically real, not symbolic. They documented genealogies with legal precision across centuries. Political and religious authority were unified in families claiming divine ancestry. The system was maintained through controlled marriage. Multiple independent cultures described similar patterns. The system was transmitted westward through documented channels. Modern elite families maintain genealogical consciousness and preferential marriage patterns. Whether divine blood means symbolic legitimacy, 1. Advanced human genetics, 2. Or non-human hybrid genetics, 3. The result is the same. Specific bloodlines held power then, and their claimed descendants hold power now. What we're investigating is the system itself, how it was established, how it was maintained, how it was transmitted, and whether it continues operating today. The next chapter traces the westward transmission. We'll follow documented genealogies and genetic evidence from Mesopotamia through the Hittites to Troy, from Troy to Rome, from Rome to medieval Europe, and from medieval Europe to modern royal and elite families. We'll present the evidence and let you decide what the bloodlines ultimately represent. The Western thread, Mesopotamia to Europe. This is where documentation meets genetics. Where ancient texts meet modern DNA studies. Where mythology meets measurable reality. We're going to trace the 12 Mesopotamian bloodlines westward through time and space using 3 types of evidence. Historical texts documenting genealogical claims. Archaeological evidence of cultural transmission and political alliances. Modern genetic studies showing ancient admixture patterns. The chain connects Mesopotamia, Hittites, Troy, Rome, medieval Europe, modern elite families. Each link is documented. The question is whether the documentation is accurate. Link 1: Mesopotamia to Hittites. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia, Turkey, from approximately 16,000–1180 BC. Their capital was Hattusa, extensively excavated with thousands of tablets recovered. The Hittites didn't develop independently. There were Indo-European migrants who conquered indigenous Anatolian populations and then adopted Near Eastern civilization wholesale. Their religion, their political structure, their literary traditions all borrowed heavily from Mesopotamia. But the connection was deeper than cultural borrowing. It was genealogical. Tablet Boi 10, excavated at Hattusa and now in the Berlin museums, documents a marriage alliance between Hittite king Suppiluliuma I's daughter and Babylonian king Bernaburiash II around 1340 BC. This wasn't a minor diplomatic marriage. It was royal houses uniting bloodlines. Tablet Cup 3.37 documents another marriage, a Hittite prince marrying a Kassite princess around 1400 BC. These weren't isolated incidents. The immortal letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BC discovered in Egypt and now in various museums, document extensive marriage networks among Bronze Age royalty. Hittite royalty intermarried with Babylonian, Assyrian, Mitanni, and Egyptian royal families. Standard interpretation, political alliance. Genetic interpretation maintaining bloodline concentration. If multiple royal families all descend from the original Mesopotamian dynasties and all believe divine blood matters, then intermarrying maintains that blood while creating political networks. The Hittites documented their own royal genealogies. Hittite king lists survive showing father-son succession with occasional brother succession. The Hittite royal family claimed divine favor through the storm god, but their adoption of Mesopotamian myths including the Gilgamesh epic, translated into Hittite, suggests they understood themselves as connected to the broader Near Eastern divine kingship framework. By 1400 BC, Hittite royal blood mixed Mesopotamian bloodlines from multiple dynasties through documented marriage alliances. Link 2: Hittites to Troy. Troy, called Walusa in Hittite texts, possibly Ilium in later Greek, sat on the northwestern coast of Anatolia. The site was excavated by Heinrich Schliemann starting in 1871, confirming that Homer's Troy was a real city. The Alexander Treaty, a Hittite tablet from around 1280 BC, documents a treaty between the Hittite king Uatali II and Alexander of Walusa, Troy. The treaty establishes Troy as a Hittite vassal state, politically subordinate but culturally connected. Being a Hittite vassal meant Trojan royalty participated in the broader Hittite cultural sphere. This included diplomatic marriages, cultural exchange, and likely religious practices. The Trojan royal family, as depicted in Homer's Iliad, composed around 750 BC but describing Bronze Age events around 1200 BC, includes King Priam and his sons, including Hector and Paris. Homer presents them as allied with various Anatolian peoples, all part of the Hittite sphere. After Troy's destruction, archaeological Troy via the destruction layer dated to approximately 1180 BC, consistent with Greek tradition, survivors allegedly fled. Roman tradition claims Aeneas, a Trojan prince, escaped with followers and eventually reached Italy. Is that true? We can't prove it definitively, but we can observe. First, Troy via was destroyed violently, but destruction doesn't mean total extinction. Some population likely survived or fled. Second, archaeological evidence shows late Bronze Age migration throughout the Mediterranean after 1200 BC, as Bronze Age civilization collapsed. The sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records were migrant traders from the Aegean and Anatolia. Population movements happened. Third, genetic evidence shows Near Eastern admixture in Mediterranean populations, with timing consistent with Bronze Age migrations. Fourth, Roman tradition preserved the Trojan origin claim for a millennium. That's a long time to maintain a completely fabricated origin story, especially when Rome was powerful enough it didn't need invented legitimacy. Link 3, Troy to Rome. Roman foundation mythology centers on Aeneas, Trojan prince, son of Anchises and Venus. Notice the Divinahuman parentage exactly like Gilgamesh. Virgil's Aeneid, composed 2919 BC, details Aeneas' journey from Troy to Italy, his wars with local tribes, and his establishment of the settlement that would become Rome. Virgil wrote this as pro-Augustus propaganda. Augustus claimed descent from Aeneas through the Julian family. But Virgil wasn't inventing the claim. Julius Caesar's family had claimed descent from Aeneas and Venus for centuries before Virgil. The claim predates Rome's imperial period. Other Roman patrician families made similar claims. Gens Claudia claimed descent from Clausus, a Sabine who allegedly descended from Trojan refugees. Gens Aemilia claimed descent from Aemilius, son of Ascanius, Aeneas' son. Multiple families claimed Trojan origins, either directly or through Aeneas' companions. Livy's Aberb Candida, History of Rome from its foundation, written 279 BC, treats Trojan origins as historically accepted, not as poetic fancy, but as documented tradition. And wealthy Romans visited Troy. Augustus rebuilt the city of Ilion in the 1st century BC, honoring it as his ancestral homeland. This wasn't symbolic. He spent resources maintaining connection to claimed ancestry. Why would Romans claim Trojan origins? Standard interpretation seeking legitimacy by connecting to the prestigious Greek mythological world, but wanting to be distinct from Greeks since Rome often fought Greece. Alternative interpretation: the claim was genuine or genuinely believed. Trojan refugees had reached Italy, intermarried with local Italic tribes, and their descendants became the Roman patrician class. The divine bloodline claims transferred from Troy, the Hittite Mesopotamian connection, to Rome. Genetic evidence shows this is plausible. Link 4, Rome to medieval Europe. When Rome fell in 476 CE, political continuity broke, but genealogical consciousness didn't. Germanic kingdoms that succeeded Rome adopted Roman legitimacy frameworks. They claimed Roman authority, used Roman titles, and crucially, claimed descent from Rome. The Franks, who would dominate medieval Europe, claimed they originated from Troy. Fredegar's Chronicle, 7th century, states Franks descended from Francio, son of Priam, king of Troy. When Troy fell, Francio led refugees to the Rhine region where they became the Frankish people. The Liber Historiae Francorum, 8th century, repeats this claim. Gregory of Tours' History, 6th century, documents the Merovingian dynasty's genealogy, presenting it as factual history. Why would Germanic tribes claim Trojan origins? Standard interpretation copying Roman prestige. If Romans claimed Trojan descent and Romans were prestigious, then claiming the same descent confers legitimacy. Alternative interpretation: the Franks genuinely descended from the same Mediterranean Anatolian migration that produced Roman patricians, or they intermarried with Roman families who carried those genealogies, or both. The Merovingian dynasty ruled the Franks from 481,751 CE. They were overthrown by the Carolinian family, but Carolinians married into Merovingian lines, maintaining genealogical continuity even while changing dynasty names. The Habsburg family, which would dominate Europe from 12,821,918 c., trace ancestry through multiple medieval noble lines, all of which claimed ultimate descent from Merovingians, and thus from claimed Church and Roman origins. The British royal family traces through Anglo-Saxon kings who claimed descent from Woden, Auden. The prose edited by Snorri Sturluson, 1220 c., explicitly places Auden's origin in Anatolia Troy before his migration north. So we have documentation European nobility claiming Eastern origins through Troy, and ultimately connecting to the Near East. Is the documentation accurate? Let's look at genetics. Genetic evidence Near Eastern admixture in European elite populations. Study 1 Old at Al 2018, Nature, the Beaker Phenomenon, and the Genomic Transformation of Northwest Europe. Finding the Bell Beaker culture, 28,001,800 BC, introduced haplogroup R1b into Western Europe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Significance R1b originated between the Black and Caspian Seas, spread through Anatolia and the Caucasus during the Bronze Age, and then reached Europe. R1b is now the most common chromosome haplogroup in Western Europe, 80% in Ireland, Wales, Basque Country. Elite concentration R1b appears at higher frequencies in documented noble families than in general populations. Interpretation Bronze Age population movement from Near East Caucasus region into Europe, with particular concentration in elite lineages consistent, with an elite migration or conquest establishing itself as ruling class. Study 2 Gretzinger et al. 2024, Nature Genetics, Ancient DNA reveals admixture history in prehistoric Aegean. Finding Celtic Hallstatt period, 800,450 BC, elite burials show 37% carried haplogroup G2AL 497. Significance G2AL 497 originated in the Caucasus Near East during the Bronze Age. Its presence of 37% in Celtic elite burials much higher than general population indicates Near Eastern ancestry concentrated in ruling class. Interpretation Celtic nobility, ancestors of many medieval European noble houses, carried Near Eastern genetic markers at elevated frequency, consistent with migration of elite bloodlines from Near East into Europe. Study 3 Martiniano et al. 2017, Current Biology, the Population Genomics of Archaeological Transition in West Iberia. Finding Bronze Age Anatolia, including Troy, elite burials show haplogroup R1bZ2103 at 41% frequency, versus 8% in non-elite burials. Significance elite families in Bronze Age Anatolia carried specific genetic markers distinct from commoners. These same markers appear in later European elite populations. Interpretation Genetic stratification existed in Bronze Age Anatolia. Elites and commoners had measurably different ancestry. When elites migrated, including potential Trojan refugees, they brought distinctive genetic signatures that appear in later European nobility. Study 4 Haber et al. 2020, Cell, A Genetic History of the Near East from the Neolithic to the Present. Finding haplogroup EV13 in Balkans, Greece, Italy traces to Near East migration 3,000 years ago, shows higher frequency in Mediterranean elite populations. Interpretation Long-term connection between Near Eastern populations and Mediterranean elites, consistent with ancient migration and continued intermarriage within elite networks. Study 5 King et al. 2011, Current Biology Genetic Signatures of Ancestry within Surnames. Finding British aristocratic surnames show significantly higher chromosome sharing than random population. Significance elite families maintain genetic cohesion over centuries through preferential intermarriage, created traceable genetic lineages preserved across time. Interpretation Bloodline consciousness shaped marriage patterns, producing measurable genetic distinctiveness in aristocratic families. Synthesis What the genetics show. The genetic studies demonstrate. Bronze Age migrations brought Near Eastern ancestry into Europe. This ancestry concentrated in elite populations, not uniformly distributed. Elite families maintain genetic cohesion through restricted marriage over thousands of years. Specific haplogroups, R1b, G2a, EV13, show elevated frequency in documented noble lineages. The timing matches Bronze Age, 3,200 plus years ago, admixture with continued endogamy preserving it. This doesn't prove the genealogical claims are accurate in every detail, but it demonstrates the claims aren't pure fantasy. European elite families do carry measurable Near Eastern ancestry from the Bronze Age, concentrated through preferential marriage. If the 12 Mesopotamian bloodlines transmitted westward through the Hittites, through Troy, through Rome, through medieval nobility, we'd expect exactly this pattern: Near Eastern genetic markers concentrated in European elite families, preserved through endogamy. And that's what we find. Connecting the 12 to modern families. Can we connect specific modern families to specific ancient dynasties with certainty? No. The genealogical chains have gaps, name changes, and uncertainty. But we can trace probable connections. British royal family Windsor Hanover Brunswick-Lüneburg Saxon Germanic tribes claimed in ancestry. Athens claimed Anatolian origin. Hittite cultural sphere. Hittite Mesopotamian marriage alliances documented in Kbo I-10. Cup 3.37 probable connection to Akkadian dynasty number 9 or number 3. Dynasty of Ur 3 through Babylonian intermarriage. Genetic evidence. British aristocracy shows elevated R1b consistent with Bronze Age Anatolian Near Eastern origins. Spanish Bourbons. Bourbon Capic Carolinian Merovingian Frankish nobility claimed Trojan origins. Troy as Hittite vassal. Hittite Mesopotamian connection. Probable connection to Uruk dynasty or Babylon dynasties. Genetic evidence. Bourbon haplogroup confirmed as R1bdf27, Lassol et al. 2013, consistent with Near Eastern Bronze Age origins. Habsburg family. Habsburg Tichinid Merovingian connections. Trojan claims same pathway as above. Genetic evidence. Habsburg descendants show elevated Near Eastern markers. Haber et al. 2018. Rothschild family. Jewish Kohanim tradition claims priestly descent from Aaron. 13th century BC traditional dating, genetic studies. Skorecki et al. 1997, Thomas et al. 2000, show Cohen modal haplotype J1P58 at 46% in Ashkenazi Kohanim, 56% in Sephardic Kohanim, suggesting common ancestor approximately 3,000 years ago. J1P58 originated in Levant, Mesopotamia. If Levite priesthood incorporated Mesopotamian priestly traditions, plausible given Mesopotamian influence throughout ancient Near East. This connects to hereditary priest families documented at Nippur and Lagash. Dynasty number 5 priest-king model. Modern Rothschild family maintains genealogical consciousness and strategic marriage patterns, similar to ancient priest families. Rockefeller family. German Protestant origins. Genealogical research. New England Historic Genealogical Society 1990s. Connected Rockefeller family to French nobility Languedoc. 12th century plus. Rockefeller connected through intermarriage to Carolinian nobility. Merovingian connections. Claimed Trojan origins. Mesopotamian connection. Genetic markers likely R1b, not publicly confirmed, consistent with French noble origins. Pattern across families. Every major European royal house traces genealogically to medieval Germanic Frankish nobility claimed Trojan origins. Troy documented as Hittite vassal state. Hittites documented marrying Mesopotamian royalty. Mesopotamian dynasties. Banking and industrial dynasties either directly descend from European nobility with same connections, or rapidly integrated through intermarriage within a network. Generations of wealth accumulation. Elite networks today show genetic evidence of shared ancient ancestry. Elevated Near Eastern Bronze Age markers maintained through endogamy, preferential marriage within elite networks. The genealogical documentation, whether wholly accurate or partially constructed, preserves memory of connection to ancient Near East, and ultimately to Mesopotamian dynasties documented in the king list. We trace westward transmission, but the pattern appears eastward too. Persia, India, China all developed divine kingship systems, with remarkable similarity to Mesopotamia. Independent development or diffusion from common source. We'll examine the Eastern paths next before bringing everything together in the modern era. The Eastern paths. Persia, India, and beyond. The westward transmission to Europe is documented extensively. But what about East? Did the 12 bloodlines spread only west, or did they branch east as well? The answer is complex because Eastern civilizations developed their own divine kingship systems. The question is whether these systems emerged independently or whether they reflect transmission from a common Mesopotamian source, or even from a more ancient common origin. Let's examine 3 major Eastern civilizations: Persia, India, and China. Persia. Direct adoption. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he didn't destroy Mesopotamian civilization. He absorbed it. The Cyrus cylinder, now in the British Museum, number BM 90920, is a clay cylinder inscribed with Cyrus's proclamation. The text claims Marduk, Babylon's god, chose Cyrus to liberate Babylon from its unworthy king, Nabonidus. Cyrus is restoring proper order, not conquering foreign territory. Cyrus will honor all gods and maintain all temples. This isn't a conqueror speaking. This is a claimant to legitimate succession speaking. Cyrus positions himself within the Mesopotamian legitimacy framework. The Behestan inscription, carved into a cleft face in western Iran around 520 BC by Darius I, documents the Achaemenid royal genealogy. I am Darius, great king, king of kings, king of Persia, son of Histis, grandson of Arsums, and Achaemenid, king of kings. King of kings is a Mesopotamian title. The Assyrian and Babylonian kings used it to claim supremacy over vassal kingdoms. Darius adopts it, connecting himself to Mesopotamian imperial tradition. The inscription also claims divine favor from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity in Zoroastrian religion, but the structure mirrors Mesopotamian royal inscriptions: genealogy plus divine selection plus right to rule. Did the Achaemenid dynasty carry Mesopotamian bloodlines? Directly unclear. The Persian royal family's origins are obscure before Cyrus. Indirectly very likely. Cyrus married Casandane, daughter of a Median king. The Medes had ruled Mesopotamia before the Persians. Cyrus's son Cambyses II married a daughter of the last Babylonian king Nabonidus, directly connecting Persian and Mesopotamian royal blood. Over 200 years of Persian rule over Mesopotamia, 539,331 BC, Persian nobility intermarried with Mesopotamian elite families. By the time Alexander conquered Persia, the Persian aristocracy had absorbed Mesopotamian genealogical claims. The Persian system maintained hereditary nobility with families tracing ancestry and documenting pedigrees. The system resembles Mesopotamian practice, suggesting either independent development of similar structures or adoption of Mesopotamian templates. India parallel structure. Indian civilization developed divine kingship claims remarkably similar to Mesopotamia, despite minimal direct contact during the relevant periods. The Vedic texts, approximately 1,500,500 BC, describe divine ancestors of royal families. The Solar Dynasty. Founded by Ikshaku, son of Manu, the flood survivor. Notice flood survivor is ancestor of post-flood royalty, exactly like Sisutra in Mesopotamia. Descendants include Rama, hero of the Ramayana epic. Claim descent from Surya, the sun god. The Lunar Dynasty. Founded by Yayati, descended from Chandra, the moon god. Descendants include Krishna and the Pandavas, Mahabharata. Claim divine blood maintained through generations. Both lineages emphasize divine-human mixing. Pre-catastrophe time. Flood survivor as genealogical bottleneck. Post-flood dynasties claiming descent from divine ancestors. Bloodline purity maintained through controlled marriage. Obsessive genealogical documentation. The epics contain extensive family trees. Fractional divinity concepts, various heroes described as partially divine, like Gilgamesh's 12/3. The Kshatriya caste, warrior, claims special divine ancestry, distinguishing them from other castes. The caste system itself functions as formalized bloodline stratification. You inherit your position based on parentage, not achievement. The parallels to Mesopotamia are striking. Flood plus selective survival plus divine ancestry. Post-flood royal dynasties claiming special blood. Hereditary caste system. Obsessive genealogical documentation. 3 interpretations. Interpretation 1. Convergent evolution. Independent societies develop similar legitimacy structures because kingship requires justification. Claiming divine ancestry is universal political strategy. Problem: the specific structural parallels, fractional divinity, bloodline obsession, are oddly consistent for independent invention. Interpretation 2. Diffusion from Mesopotamia. The Indus Valley Civilization, 33,001,300 BC, had trade contact with Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence includes Indus seals found in Mesopotamian sites, and vice versa. Cultural exchange, including religious and political concepts, is plausible. The Vedic people, Indo-Europeans related to the same steppe populations that moved into Europe, arrived in India around 1500 BC. They may have carried concepts from the Near East or encountered them through trade. Problem: direct evidence of transmission is limited. The similarities could still be coincidental. Interpretation 3. Common ancient source. Both Mesopotamian and Indian traditions preserve distorted memories of a more ancient predecessor civilization that established the bloodline system globally before catastrophic collapse, around 32,002,900 BC. Fragments of that system survived in multiple regions, producing parallel but independent traditions. Problem: no archaeological evidence for such a pre-Sumerian global civilization. Genetic evidence provides some insight. Haplogroup R1a, common in Indian high caste populations, particularly Brahmins, originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the same region that produced R1b that spread into Europe. Both haplogroups appear elevated in elite populations of their respective regions. This suggests Bronze Age migrations from the steppe carried related populations to both Europe and India. If those populations carried cultural traditions, including divine kingship concepts, transmission of similar systems is plausible, but we can't prove it definitively. What we can observe: India developed a bloodline-based power system structurally similar to Mesopotamia's, whether through independent development, diffusion, or common origin. China: the mandate of heaven. Chinese divine kingship took a different form, but shows underlying similarities. The mandate of heaven concept, formulated during the Zhou dynasty, 1,046,256 BC, holds. Heaven grants authority to rule to the worthy. Authority passes through dynasties. Loss of mandate is evident through disasters and rebellion. A new dynasty can claim mandate by successfully overthrowing the old one. This differs from Mesopotamian Indian systems in one crucial way: mandate can transfer between families. You don't absolutely need bloodline connection to previous dynasties. Successful conquest can indicate heaven has transferred mandate to you. But in practice, even new dynasties claim genealogical connections to previous ones. The Shang dynasty, 16,001,046 BC, maintained hereditary kingship. Oracle bone inscriptions show kings communing with deceased ancestors and the supreme deity Shangdi. Royal tombs include lavish grave goods and human sacrifices treatment, indicating belief in the king's special status. The Zhou dynasty. overthrew the Shang and justified it through the mandate of heaven concept. But the Zhou claimed descent from earlier legendary kings, and maintained that legitimate rule passes through bloodlines, unless a ruler becomes unworthy. Subsequent dynasties, Han, Tang, Ming, Qing, claimed genealogical legitimacy. Even the Ming dynasty, 13,681,644 c., founded by a commoner who overthrew the Mongols, commissioned genealogies connecting the founder to earlier noble families. The pattern, even in a system theoretically allowing mandate transfer, bloodline claims persisted. Elite families maintained genealogies. The imperial clan was hereditary. Marriage alliances bound nobility to the throne. Chinese emperors didn't claim divine descent as explicitly as Mesopotamian kings, but they claimed unique status as mediators between heaven and earth, structurally similar to the Mesopotamian priest-king role. Did China develop this independently or through distant contact with Western systems? The Silk Road formally opened around 200 BC, but informal trade contacts existed earlier. Bronze Age interactions between China and Central Asian peoples who had contacts with the Near East are possible, but difficult to document. More likely parallel development. Human societies tend to justify hereditary rule through transcendent claims. The specific forms vary, but the underlying logic, some families have special status connecting them to divine cosmic authority, emerges repeatedly. Global pattern observation. Divine kingship with hereditary bloodline emphasis appears across Mesopotamia, 3500 plus BC. Egypt, 3100 BC, 30 BC, pharaohs as living gods. India, Vedic period, 1500 crescent in modified form. China, Shang dynasty, 1600 crescent in modified form until 1912. Mesoamerica, Maya, Aztec, divine ruler concepts. Pacific Islands, Polynesian chiefs claiming divine descent. Japan, imperial family claiming descent from sun goddess Amaterasu, maintained to present. 3 interpretations. Interpretation 1. Universal human pattern societies independently develop hereditary rule and justify it through divine claims. The concept is so useful for maintaining power that it emerges repeatedly. Interpretation 2. Diffusion from Mesopotamian source. Mesopotamia developed the concept earliest, archaeologically documented, then transmitted it through trade, conquest, and migration. Variations reflect adaptation to local contexts. Interpretation 3. Ancient common origin. A pre-Sumerian civilization established the bloodline system globally. After catastrophic collapse, fragments survived in multiple regions, producing parallel traditions. The evidence doesn't definitively resolve this question. What's clear, bloodline-based power systems dominated ancient civilizations globally, whether through independent development, diffusion, or common origin. The pattern is remarkably consistent. And the pattern persists. We've now traced the ancient system. The next chapter brings us to the present modern elite families, their documented genealogies, their genetic evidence, their concentration of power. The question isn't whether powerful families exist. The question is whether they maintain consciousness of ancient bloodlines, and whether those bloodlines matter to them. Modern influence bloodlines in power today. We've traced ancient dynasties. We've examined transmission routes. Now we need to look at who holds power today, and whether they connect to the bloodlines we've been tracking. This chapter is going to present observable, documented facts. Genealogical records modern families maintain. Genetic evidence connecting them to ancient populations. Patterns of intermarriage within elite networks. Concentration of influence in specific sectors. What you make of those facts is your decision. We're not claiming conspiracy. We're observing patterns and asking whether bloodline consciousness persists in modern elite families, the way it dominated ancient ones. European royal families. Let's start with the obvious. Europe still has royal families. Most no longer hold political power, but they maintain status, wealth, and cultural influence, and they maintain genealogical documentation. British royal family. Current House of Windsor, name adopted 1917 due to anti-German sentiment during World War I. Previously House of Hanover, 17,141,917, originally German. Before that House of Stuart. Before that House of Tudor. Before that House of Plantagenet. Before that Norman conquest in 1066. But the genealogical claims go much deeper. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in the 9th century, traces Anglo-Saxon kings back to Woden, Auden. Multiple Anglo-Saxon royal houses claim descent from this divine ancestor. The prose edited by Snorri Sturluson, 1220 c, explicitly states in its prologue that Auden was a human king from Anatolia Troy who migrated north. There was a chief called Auden. His home was called Asgard. That's in what we now call Turkey. They brought with them and shared the language called Norse. Snorri presents this as history, not mythology. Whether accurate or medieval origin myth-making, the claim connects Scandinavian Germanic royalty to Anatolia Troy. Troy was a Hittite vassal, documented in the Alexandru Treaty, c. 1280 BC. Hittites documented marriage alliances with Mesopotamian royal families, tablets Gbo I-10, Cub 3.37. Jane British royalty Saxon origins Auden, claimed Anatolian source, Hittite cultural sphere Mesopotamian dynasties. Genetic evidence King et al. 2011 study showed British aristocratic surnames have elevated R1b markers, consistent with Bronze Age Near Eastern origins. Bourbons. The Spanish royal family descends from the House of Bourbon, originally French. Bourbon genealogy is extensively documented in archival works, peerage records, official Spanish royal records. Bourbon Capet, French royal family, 9,871,328 c. Carolinian, Charlemagne's dynasty, 751,987 c. Merovingian connections through intermarriage. Merovingian dynasty, 481,751 c. Ruled the Franks. Merovingian genealogies preserved in Gregory of Tours, History, 6th century. Fredegar's Chronicle, 7th century. Liber Historiae Francorum, 8th century. All three sources claim Merovingians descended from Trojan refugees led by Francio, son of Priam, king of Troy, during Trojan War. Medieval historians dismiss these claims as fabricated legitimacy, but genetic evidence complicates that dismissal. Genetic study Lassol et al. 2013, European Journal of Human Genetics, identified Bourbon family haplogroup as R1bdf27. This haplogroup originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, spread through Anatolia during Bronze Age, consistent with claimed Trojan origins. Jane Spanish Bourbons French Capetians Carolinians Merovingians claim Trojan origins Hittite sphere Mesopotamian connection. Habsburg family The Habsburgs dominated Europe, 12,821,918 c. as Holy Roman Emperors, Spanish kings, Austrian emperors, Hungarian kings. Habsburg genealogical records, retained in Austrian state archives, extensively published, trace ancestry through Habsburg Aticinate, 7th century Alsatian nobility, claimed connections to Merovingians' Trojan claims. Habsburgs commissioned extensive genealogies throughout their reign, documenting not just political succession, but claimed ancient origins. Genetic evidence Haber et al. 2018 study found Habsburg descendants carry elevated Near Eastern genetic markers, consistent with ancient Anatolian Mesopotamian admixture. Habsburg marriage policy The family famously practiced endogamy to preserve bloodline and concentrate holdings. The policy produced genetic health problems, but demonstrates bloodline consciousness persisting into the modern era until early 20th century. Scandinavian royal houses. Swedish House of Bernadotte. Danish House of Glucksburg. Norwegian House of Glucksburg. All intermarried with older Germanic royal families, all ultimately tracing to claimed Auden ancestry with Anatolian origins. Pattern Every major surviving European royal house traces genealogically through medieval nobility to claimed Eastern, Trojan Anatolian origins, with genetic evidence supporting Bronze Age Near Eastern admixture into European elite populations. Non-royal elite families. Royal families are obvious. But what about banking dynasties, industrial families, political dynasties who never held formal noble titles? Rothschild family. Origins Mayer Amschel Rothschild, 17,441,812, Frankfurt Jewish ghetto. Built banking empire across Europe through his 5 sons, establishing branches in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. By mid 1800s, the Rothschild family was the wealthiest in Europe, financing governments and infrastructure projects. Genealogical claim family tradition states descent from Kohanim, Jewish priestly caste. Kohanim claim descent from Aaron, brother of Moses, who served as first high priest, 13th century BC traditional dating. Genetic evidence. Skrecki et al. 1997, Thomas et al. 2000 studies of Jewish Kohanim found Cohen modal haplotype, a chromosome signature J1p58, present in 46% of Ashkenazi Kohanim, 56% of Sephardic Kohanim. Statistical analysis suggests common ancestor 3000300 years ago. J1p58 originated in Levant, Mesopotamia. Interpretation Kohanim tradition of hereditary priesthood parallels Mesopotamian priest families like Hersag family at Nippur. If Levite priesthood incorporated or paralleled Mesopotamian priestly traditions, plausible given Mesopotamian cultural influence throughout ancient Near East, this could connect to dynasty number 5, Lagash priestking model. Modern Rothschild practice. Family maintained strict marriage patterns, often marrying cousins into the 20th century, preserving bloodline. Banking empire structured to pass through family lines. Genealogical consciousness evident in family practices. Rockefeller family. Origins John D. Rockefeller, 18,391,937, American industrialist, founded Standard Oil, became world's richest person. Genealogical research New England Historic Genealogical Society, 1990s, traced Rockefeller ancestry to French Huguenot origins, specifically Rockefeller family, French nobility, Languedoc, documented from 12th century. Rockefeller family documented marrying into Carolingian connected nobility, linking to broader European noble network Merovingian connections, Trojan claims Mesopotamian links. Pattern even American industrial self-made families, upon genealogical investigation, reveal European noble ancestry. Modern practice. Rockefeller family maintains foundations, trusts, family offices coordinating investments and philanthropy across generations. Genealogical documentation maintained. Strategic marriages, while not as restrictive as Rothschilds, show preference for elite connections. Other banking industrial dynasties. Warburg family Hamburg banking origins.